Chessman Dan, day 9 of playing chess every day until Melina and I beat Jones with a stick. In today's game, I am playing as white and I'll be using the London system. And this is the first time in my series thus far I played the London system and my opponent knows the main line. So it is a very interesting game. I'm also playing an opponent who's rated 475 ELO, which is the highest I've ever played against. Regardless, we're going to see how well I do. Final recap of today's chess journey. I've played 6 games. I've won 4, lost 2. So not too bad. I'm improving every day, and we're going to get started. So typically with the London system, you're going to start off Queen's Pawn opening. My opponent responds with D5. I kick out my bishop. He responds with Knight to F6. The idea with Knight F6 is that he is eyeing the center right here, so E4. I respond with Pawn to E3. Here, my opponent responds with Knight to G4, and this is where I'm a little confused because I'm not sure if he's trying to go for that pawn or trying to fork my queen and my rook. However, I would just take with my king. Here, I move my pawn to H3. The idea is I'm trying to kick out the knight and open up my H file. Here, my opponent moves back, Knight F6. I then respond to Knight to D2. So Knight to D2 is defending this white square, an E4. So in the event my opponent decided to move, we go here. If he decided to go here, I would just take, and I'll keep control of the center. And it'll be 1-for-1 exchange. So regardless, I don't want my opponent to have control of the center. Here my opponent responds with a Knight to C6. I go C3. My opponent is building his pyramid as well. Here, I am almost done fully developing the London system in terms of having my pyramid and my bishops attacking kingside. Here, my opponent responds by putting his bishop to D6. The idea with bishop to D6, especially with someone who knows how to play against the London system, is he's trying to put pressure on my dark squared bishop. And there are different ways I could do. The worst way, in my opinion, that someone could respond to this as white is if I were to take, because all that would do is he would retake with a queen, and now his queen is developed, and now his queen has complete access to, these 2 diagonals, and they're applying immense pressure in the center. So there's different ways I could go about this. Typically in the main line, you also see a response to the dark squared bishop's meeting is going backwards. However, this usually is the idea being typically the H pawn would still be at 2. My opponent would take, and then I would take again with the pawn. However, it didn't make sense. And also, I wanted him to take. Another way of taking is if my opponent were to, let's say I just didn't bother. I'm going to move here. If my opponent were to take, I would then take. And just like that, we in control of the center. I didn't expect my opponent to take it, so right now we just have a bishop standoff. Here, I respond with Knight to F3. My opponent castles. The moment he castles, I'm very excited. London system, we are attacking kingside, and we normally don't begin our attack until after the king castles. Here, I put my Knight to E5, controlling the center, as well as inviting for contact. There's different ways this could go about. My ideal situation would have been something like this. I would have taken, he would have taken, I would have taken, and now my opponent would have to move the pawn. Yep. And then from there, I could go here. He would go, mate in 1. Checkmate. That's kind of the presence of the London system. There's different variations you could do, such as the Greek sacrifice. So I'm very close. My opponent definitely knows the London system, so he's just building pressure in the center. However, when you build pressure in the center that way and you keep all your focus very symmetrically, especially at this low level, it still gives me the advantage. If we open up the analysis, it's still even, but I feel like I have way more control. Here, I move my queen to E2. The idea being is I want to eventually get my queen to kingside. However, typically you would move your queen out here. However, with this knight, he would take. So my opponent moves pawn to g6, and my opponent is very savvy in that, is that he's preventing the Greek sacrifice. Or, because typically, like, in the event, let's just say this trade-off happens. So I take, he takes, take. He can move it back. I have openings right here. It probably would matter with the light square bishop. Let's just say, you know, whatever. I would essentially move, check, and then, you know, I don't know, something like that. That wasn't the best explanation. However, my opponent putting his pawn there is preventing my light squared bishop from attacking his king side. Here, I castle. At this point, we're keeping immense pressure. We're still in the opening. And keep in mind, we are on move 12, and no action has been happening. Here, my opponent moves his pawn to b5. So now you're going to see a race between who's going to get to the king side first. Because I castled opposite sides, my opponent is going to be attacking king side or queen side, and I'm going for his king side. So it's essentially going to be a race to who gets to the king first. This is my thought process going beyond it. So therefore, the moment I see my opponent kicking out his bishop, or his pawn, instead of in the past, I was so blindly focused on what I want, I had to take a second and be like, what does black want? And clearly, my black wants to open up this side and attack the king, because if my opponent is able to break through the left side of the board, I'm in trouble. So here, in response, I move my pawn to h5. Different ways of going about it. Essentially, I just want to open up the h file. My opponent here puts his pawn to b4, essentially opening up the c file for my king. Here, I decide to take. So now my king has an opening. He takes again with a pawn f6. Here, I decided in my darkest hour, I will channel my inner Gotham chess and sacrifice the fucking rook! Yeah, this probably wasn't the best sacrifice, but, you know, I just needed to make some action. I'm like, all right, we're in the middle game now. Here, naturally, my opponent takes. And you can see here, evaluation board, based on my rook sacrifice, not really anything is gained. Probably could have been better sacrifices. However, I was just opening up the king side. So in my opinion, and my thought process is now the h file is open. So here, I respond with a check. And my opponent can't take my bishop because obviously it is guarded by the knight. Here, my opponent rolls back, and this is where it gets tense. I see a checkmate coming. I could smell it. I could see it. Here, I move my pawn. I put my rook to the h file. So now my opponent can only move here legally. So I'm trapping the king in a corner. Here, my opponent goes bishop to e5. I respond. Kind of how the original analysis of how the center trading would go. I would take. Here, my opponent moves his knight back. And now you see the evaluation board, mate in 3. Here, we got mate in 2. Once I move my queen out to h5. Because now his king's not, his rook's, his knight's not in defending against the queen. Here, my opponent said, take it. I don't want to win. And I checkmate. So this was probably one of, in terms of my series thus far, the most intense game, because I just wanted to win. Not every game's going to go like this, but I ended up winning. I finished off with the ELO of 466 for today's game, for today's day. Bye.